Okay, this is a quick impromptu of gluing in the grains of a 54 4000 motor. This particular one is a red motor that we're getting ready to static test in the next couple days. We have 4 grains. We'll get a little closer here. They are taped together. Hopefully we can see this in the video. They've got just clear scotch tape. They are cut and trimmed so there's no overlap. The motor is marked in lines so you can align all the grains together precisely. It's marked at the nozzle end, which is bored out a little larger than what we have at the top end. The top end's bored out for the smoke grain. Forward bulkhead up at the top. Once everything's taped together and the grains are aligned, then you have a place for your epoxy to make a mess. Get your epoxy already mixed up. Got your liner. Nozzle this end. Top end will be marked for forward bulkhead. It's already pre-sanded. Hopefully, you won't be able to see all of this probably in the video, but we're going to just take the cup of epoxy and pour it down the side, nice and slow. Pouring it all out, not quite all. And then wipe that epoxy all over the grains. And I put my forefinger, probably can't see it and I'm sorry, I didn't get zoomed out far enough. Putting my forefinger in the top of the grain to hold it, trying to keep the rest of my left hand clean. I've dripped some down on the bottom here. I'm trying to wipe it up. Try and avoid placing the bottom grain in that mess. And I'm just pouring out the rest of the epoxy. I've weighed out 20 grams of West Systems 105 resin and then 4 grams of the hardener. I'm using the fast hardener here, and again this is already mixed up. I'm going to let that stand there and get the rest of this out on my fingers. I think I just got my hair. Okay. Basically want to slather the whole stack of grains with epoxy. Give it a little twisting motion as we go down. Wipe up any excess. Once we start pushing the liner down on these, it's going to force out the majority of this epoxy, which is good because we want to make sure it gets all the way down to the bottom. Now if you're wondering why the grains are taped together, well obviously I'm gluing this entire stack at once, not one grain at a time. The grain faces are chamfered, cut manually with a knife, so we don't need any O-rings in between for grain spacing. There's plenty of a gap between them. The tape keeps the grains from being inhibited by any epoxy or glue that might get in the way. In between them, if you were doing them one at a time, as well, it acts like a small dam. So as I slide the liner down, that wrap of tape at each grain segment is going to force epoxy up the liner as I slide it down, ensuring that I've got plenty of epoxy up inside the liner between the casting tubes and the liner. During this whole process, I'm being extremely careful to keep my left hand clean, wiping it off here. Make Make sure I don't get any on the liner. I take the nozzle end up to the top. And I slowly slide it down. Hopefully you'll be able to see that the epoxy is building up at the edge here. I'm just going to slowly slide it down. I'm going to spin this every once in a while just to make sure that I've got everything covered. I'll stop every now and then, let the epoxy drain down, take my left or right hand and try and help coat it the rest of the way down. Push it down some more. At this point, it's starting to stick pretty good. Continue pushing. I'm going to take my cup and I'm going to scoop up some of this excess because I have plenty on there, which is what you want. You don't want to be shy of epoxy. This motor leaves no room for error. It's going to make sure everything is glued in. And as this bead of epoxy rolls down, pretty much ensures that the entire motor all the way down is going to get coated. I'll spin it around there real quick. See that? Pushing it down nice and slow. When we get to the bottom, make sure it's flat. Go all the way down to the bottom. Pick it up real quick. Got your epoxy covered hand. Got a dirty paper towel here, but no epoxy on it. I'm just going to take it and wipe off all the excess. I've got a can of acetone here. If you can see that, I'm going to go over this later. Make sure I've got all the epoxy wiped off. Now it's in there. I'm going to set that down for a moment. I'm going to take off my epoxy covered glove. I'm going to take my single use nozzle. There will be a piece of saran wrap that's double folded over, included in the reload. I'm going to set that on top of the nozzle. I'm going to go back over this once more and get all the epoxy off the bottom. If you happen to get some on your fingers, make sure you wipe it off, otherwise you're going to get it on here. If you do, that's okay, just make sure you go back over it with some acetone or alcohol. Now, I'm going to take the nozzle with the saran wrap over it. The saran wrap keeps the epoxy off the nozzle. I'm going to put that on the end here and then push it in. Once it's pushed in all the way, make sure you don't have anything on your fingers. Make sure it's good and tight, pushed in all the way. And now basically, you can leave this alone. Let it sit in a corner, standing upright. If you lay it on its side, the epoxy will settle to the bottom. There is a small tiny gap in between the casting tube and the liner. Basically, I want to make sure that any excess epoxy, if it's going to run anywhere, it runs down to the bottom. When it does, it's going to hit the saran wrap here. It's going to be blocked. It's basically going to form a dam at the bottom, so it ensures that you've got plenty of epoxy holding that bottom grain in. When the motor's done burning, propellant at the bottom is going to burn away first. It's going to burn away that casting tube into the glue, eventually the liner. but you're going to make sure that nothing gets spit out as one big chunk, and that's important because that's bad, basically. After this is set up, what you want to do is you want to leave your cup of epoxy sitting on the table. Come back every once in a while, check it with a little stick, poke at it, see if it's hard. Epoxy in the cup's going to set up quicker than the epoxy in the motor because this is much thinner. Thinned out epoxy takes longer to cure. Once it's set up, then you're going to be able to come back, pull the nozzle out, and then take a straight razor blade, go back and clean any epoxy up that has accumulated down around the bottom to make sure that when you put your nozzle back in, it goes in. It doesn't get blocked by buildup of epoxy. As well, you'll have enough of this saran wrap left over that you can actually cut off half of it. If you put it over on, just use one half of it, cut the other half off. And what we can do here is pull the nozzle off, come up close. There's very little left on the saran wrap. There's really almost nothing on the liner there. Not that you can see, but there is a thin film. Make sure you set that down the right way. Sticky side up. You can come back, go over this with a paper towel. Might even wad it up a little bit. Make sure it gets all the way in the cracks. Spin it around. You got all the epoxy off. Once that's done, then, oh, careful. See, I almost made a mistake there. I almost set the liner down and put epoxy. I happen to have another sheet here. Otherwise, you just cut that second half off. Put the nozzle back in. Stand up. And then just push down. Make sure that you didn't accidentally push the propellant stack up inside the liner. If you did that and you didn't push it back down, when you put the bulkhead in the top, it's not going to fit. That wouldn't be good. So make sure that it's pushed down all the way. Don't do that. Make sure you lean it up in a corner so it doesn't fall over. Got my bulkhead here, the smoke drain installed. I'm just going to push this down in here. Make sure that it sits all the way down, and yes it does. So everything's good to go. I can go set this in a corner, let it cure, come back in half an hour, an hour. Make sure that the epoxy is fully cured. Again, when this cup hardens up, the thin stuff on the table is still going to be wet and tacky. Don't fly the motor yet. Wait till it's completely cured. It's best to do this the night or the day before you're going to fly this motor. Once it's done, pull the nozzle out, peel the saran wrap off. Again, do that once the epoxy has got to the gel stage, where it's not going to flow anywhere. Go back over it with your straight razor blade, clean up any epoxy that might have cooled down at the bottom just to make sure that the nozzle goes in nice and clean, not getting hung up on anything, otherwise you're going to have to scrape at it with a pocket knife. Once it's done, then grease the entire motor liner. I like to use high temperature axle grease myself. I'm probably not even in the video. And coat the entire liner with axle grease. Slide the motor case on from the top end of the motor all the way down. You will push in. You'll push in the nozzle all the way past the end of the case. You'll install a 2-turn spiral retaining ring. Put a little bit of a grease up at the top of the liner here, on the inside for the O-ring on the shoulder. Push that in, and then you will push the top end of the bulkhead back into the motor case. The nozzle will go through the 2-turn retaining ring and be secure. And then you'll install the snap ring at the top of the motor. That snap ring needs to have the ears ground down. I sell those for $2.50, 50 cents more just for the time and labor of grinding it down to fit. Once that's completed, you're pretty much good to go to fly. Make sure, of course, you put the O-ring on the smoke ring, put the snap ring in the smoke ring groove, put the O-ring on the bulkhead, O-ring on the nozzle, grease the heck out of everything to fill up any empty voids, and you will have one heck of an awesome flight, I guarantee. Thanks for watching, and thank you very much for your business. I do appreciate it.